Time travel in the MCU was given a fairly straightforward explanation in Avengers Endgame, and then expanded upon in Loki Season 1. The idea being that we are on a timeline, and anytime that we were to go back and make an adjustment or a change to our timeline, it would just branch off and create a completely separate timeline. So we cannot change our own past. Changing the past would not change the future that we have already lived. It instead would be something completely different. The thing is, we've had a couple of MCU properties since that point that seem to contradict this idea. We have in Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan goes back in time and saves her grandmother, which allows her mother to be born, which allows her to be born, which allows her to go back and save her grandmother. In Loki Season 2, he's time slipping and making adjustments that seem to adjust the timeline he is on. And so I hear people saying, this contradicts what we've learned. This is ruining the time travel, but I don't think that's the case. I think time travel in the MCU still works the way they described. And there are explanations to correspond with these changes. So today I'm going to go over why I think Kamala going back in time and saving her grandmother still fits in with the timeline that we have come to learn, with how time travel has been laid out. And in a future video, I'm going to talk about Loki and a unified time travel theory. But for today, let's look at Kamala Khan and her trip back in time. In Ms. Marvel, the way that Kamala Khan is able to time travel back in time is through the bangle. Her great-grandmother Aisha had spoken a spell or some sort of an activation into the bangle, and it caused it to reach out through space and time to try and find someone who meets the requirements that were spoken. Aisha said, "The one you are seeking is seeking you." Now, she seemed to be thinking about her daughter in that instance. The daughter was looking for her. It was looking for her and her father. And so she said, "The one you are seeking is seeking you." The thing is, that fit for Kamala. In the future, Kamala is looking for answers. She's looking for answers specifically about Aisha. So the one Kamala is seeking is Aisha. And Aisha is seeking somebody to help. And so the bangle pulls Kamala through space and time and allows Kamala to help her grandmother onto that train. This does seem like a contradiction because Kamala is going back in time and changing the past that she has lived through. How is that possible? Well, I think that there actually is a branch here, multiple branches, that allows this to actually work out. Okay, let me back up for a second. Let's say, for example, Kamala was not able to come back in time. Let's say maybe there is no Kamala. That Aisha spoke this spell, this activation into the bangle, and it reached forward and was not able to pull someone out. The result being that her daughter would not have made it onto the train. And the daughter's father would also not have made it on the train because we see that he doesn't actually go on the train until after he has her. So they don't make it out. I think that she still would have found her father because we see that he is moving in her direction and she is standing still when Kamala shows up. They would have found each other, but they would not have found each other in time. They would not have found each other in enough time to make it onto that train and to get out of there. So what would have happened? Well, maybe they would have made it out another day, or maybe they would have had to try and settle where they were, but their lives would have been completely different. And this may not have led to a Kamala at all. So there'd be nobody to pull back, right? Well, not necessarily. Now that we know that that timeline is an option, if we look back at the moment that spell is cast, if that bangle is reaching out, then knowing that timeline future exists, and it is reaching into it to try and find somebody to pull back, it could still find somebody. Even if there's no Kamala, it could pull somebody else. And if it pulls somebody else, that someone else could still help Kamala's grandmother, could help her make it onto that train. And then the rest of that timeline would work the way that we have already seen. She would go off, live her life. She would get married. She would have Kamala's mother, who would have Kamala, who would have this adventure with the bangle. The difference would be that the stories may not be the same. The stories of following the stars to find her father, those may have been the thing that's lost. Or they may not. We don't know who it would have pulled. Maybe it would have just pulled somebody from the future who happened to have a flashlight on them, and they use the flashlight and it looks like stars. Either way, whether the stories change or not, we now have a timeline with a Kamala in it. Now let's look back at that speaking into the bangle, the activation. At that point, now the bangle sees two timelines. From that point, it has two options. And it can look forward and see Kamala in the future who is looking for answers about Aisha. And now it has someone it can pull. It pulls that version of Kamala back. That Kamala can use her powers to create these stars and guide her grandmother onto that train. And now we have another timeline, a new branch, because that Kamala has now created a separate branch, a third option. And on that timeline, we now have that grandmother having Kamala's mother, who has Kamala. And now the stories line up. It is exactly what Kamala has heard in Miss Marvel, that she was guided onto the train by the stars. And now, when the bangle is looking for somebody, at that point, it has three options. It has these three timelines. And so now it can pull the Kamala who has heard these stories. Now it can pull our Kamala back in time. And that allows her to set off this chain of events that leads to herself. Because this branch is the one that the bangle chose to pull from. And in pulling from that branch, it allows that branch to remain as it is. Now maybe this creates a whole bunch of infinite branches who are each pulling a Kamala from a parallel branch. But from the impression I get from Loki and from what I've seen of time travel, it seems like if the timeline gets back on track, it ties back in. We see this in Endgame when they talk about returning the stones. The branch timeline can merge back into one timeline again. If Kamala coming back is creating that third branch, then the Kamala from that branch coming back will create the same branch, and it'll be able to merge immediately back into the way it was. So that gives us three branches. One of them with a Kamala who can come back and set off things to essentially save her grandmother and herself. Now, I hear what some of you are saying. What about the TVA? Aren't the TVA going around pruning all the excess branches? We can't have three branches, or else we'd have chaos. The TVA is stopping that from happening. So once that first person comes back and creates a branch, isn't the TVA just going to prune that branch and make it go away? Well, maybe, but no, they're not. You see, the TVA is not just pruning the branches after the original. They're not trying to protect the original timeline. They're trying to protect the sacred timeline. This is the timeline that He Who Remains had decided should be the one that remains. This is the timeline that He wants to happen. So when we have that point where the bangle is branching off, and we have three options, the option where they don't make it on the train, the option where somebody else helps them onto the train, or the option where Kamala helps them onto the train. There are three options here. And it comes down to He Who Remains to decide which of these three stays and which ones go. And so in this moment, he is deciding that the one where Kamala is able to exist, to come back in time, to set things off for her branch, that is the one that was decided to be the sacred timeline. And the one where nobody helps them onto the train, and the one where someone completely separate helps them onto the train, those are the ones that end up getting pruned. And the TVA allows Kamala to have this looped time in the sacred timeline. So that is how Kamala Khan can go back and influence her own past. We know that changing the past cannot change the future. But if the past is already established in the way that you are going to make it, then you can go back and create the branch that led to the timeline you are on. So I hope that made sense. Stay tuned, because in a few weeks I'm going to have a video about a unified time travel theory, and it's going to include the Loki information about him time slipping. But I need Loki season 2 to wrap up first before I can create that video. So stay tuned, and thank you for watching.